I look out across the water, I smell the salt and feel the breeze, but in my heart I hear the calling of my old home, Tennessee. We don't know where these rivers flow, or why the wind chooses when and where to blow. The sun is gonna rise.
And so when I got here in the dark, I wasn't fiddling around trying to figure out. Good morning, everyone. Absolutely gorgeous morning here in the Alabama hills of California. And today, this video, I want to talk about blue hour. Blue hour is that time between right before sunrise and right after sunset. But for me specifically, it's that time when the stars start to show up after sunset, or they're still visible before the sunrise. Technically, the sun hasn't come up right now, but there's no way I could see or capture any stars. So blue hour for me has kind of already passed. Some people will define blue hour a little bit differently, but that's kind of how I think of blue hour. And one of the biggest tips that I can tell you for shooting blue hour is you have to scout your location. You can't just show up unknown to the spot that you're trying to shoot and try to find your compositions, because a lot of the times you're going to be shooting in the dark, which is exactly what I had to do this morning. So last night for sunset, I came to this exact spot, pretty famous spot here in the Alabama hills, the Mobius Arch. Super cool, one of the cooler arches I've ever seen, plus it silhouettes or frames the mountains in the background, the Sierras. And without coming and scouting, I would have been a little bit lost in even finding where it was. So I already knew the shot I wanted to take. I had a good idea of where my camera needed to be, my tripod setup, and all those things. So that is the biggest tip for shooting blue hour. It's a little bit different than shooting the Milky Way and stuff, because a lot of the times for the Milky Way or star shots, you need to calculate where those things are going to be depending on the time and the moon. So you don't want too much brightness in the moon, but you still need your Milky Way to line up with whatever you're taking. In this particular case, you don't have to worry about that as much. Sometimes a little bit of moonlight could help. You can actually shoot some of these shots with just moonlight and the stars as long as you can balance your exposure, but that's a whole nother topic in itself. So, biggest tip, make sure you scout your location, know your spot, know how you're going to shoot it, and you'll probably come away with something great. Second tip is balancing your exposure for your background and the stars. And that happens basically on timing. So you have to get there early enough to where you can still capture the stars enough in your frame, but have enough light on the detail that's in your frame, such as the arch that I was shooting or those mountains in the background. And there's really a small window where you can still capture the stars and get enough detail on what you're shooting until it gets too bright, until the sun comes up, or until the light fades if you're shooting sunset blue hour. Those two tips are your biggest things. I have some more tips coming up in the rest of this video, but for now, I'm going to keep taking a few of the shots as the sun comes up and enjoy this beautiful morning. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. And Johnny, whoever just ran into me, nice meeting you, man. Thank you. Calling of Tennessee. Who we to know where these rivers flow, or why the wind chooses when and where to blow. The sun is gonna rise each and every time, and I've still got Tennessee. I miss the smoke on the Cumberland and the fireflies at midnight and the color Good evening, everyone. Beautiful, beautiful evening. The sun hasn't, I think it's fully set, but it's at least gone behind these peaks. And the next tip I have for you involves the sun and the sunrise and sunset. And that is knowing where the sun is going to hit during sunrise and sunset when you're shooting blue hour. It's really important because this morning, for example, it rose behind the camera, meaning as it rises, the darkest part of the sky is still the spot over here where these mountains are. But it's also illuminating all of this part as well, and it allows me to be able to capture the stars while still illuminating the foreground in a perfect balance, like I talked about before, in terms of that timing window where you have that short amount of window where you can get the foreground and the stars all in one shot. Now, to contrast that, the sun sets behind these mountains. And what's going to happen is, while I wait for blue hour, I'm never going to end up seeing those stars while there's still light on these mountains behind me. And that's because that the brightest part of the sky as the sun sets is going to be right behind these mountains, meaning the stars are going to show up great back here, right behind the camera, in the opposite direction that I'm shooting, when there's still some foreground light that I can capture in one shot. But that's not going to happen here, because if I try to expose for the foreground, it's just going to be too bright. The sky is going to be bright white because, again, the sun is going to continue to illuminate this side as I go into blue hour. So that's what's important, is you have to plan for when the sun and where the sun is going to be based on your composition. So it's either going to be blue hour during sunrise or blue hour during sunset, but it probably won't be both, just because in terms of how the sun rises and sets and the lighting on what you're trying to take a shot of. So this morning, definitely think I got the shot. This evening, don't think I'm going to get the shot that I want. Now, a caveat to all this, and things that you can do if those don't work out for you or your composition doesn't get the light that it needs, is technically I could lock in a shot right now and shoot the foreground and not worry about the background. And then later, take the same exact shot without moving it while the stars are out. The only problem is it can be really hard to blend those two together. As you can tell, just like this clip you're seeing me right now in, is that this sky is going to be very bright and the mountains are going to be exposed correctly, but the sky is just going to be bright white. Then I'm going to wait and shoot the stars and try to blend that together, which is going to be a dark sky blended with a bright mountain. And getting those two to blend in a good gradient is difficult. So trying to get it all in one shot is super beneficial, means way less post work, and it's just easier on you. The other thing you can do, and this is not going to be about blue hour, but it is something to keep in mind, is actually the moon right now is decently bright. And if last night was any indication, I could actually wait until the stars come out and everything is dark and just use the moonlight to basically light or illuminate my entire foreground, which does work, but that's not during blue hour. That's just a night shot. Anyways, hope that tip was helpful. The next thing I'm going to do is actually go in and edit the photos from this morning and talk about those a little bit and just show you that kind of blend between being able to see the stars and some nice soft light before the sun comes up on my foreground and my mountains that I shot this morning. So here's me from the future.
How's it going, everyone? As you can tell, I've got some desk space back here in Denver, so I can actually do a proper breakdown of this particular video. So I'm not going to do a full edit of these images. I'm just going to kind of go through a few of them to articulate a little bit more of what I was talking about in the field. And then I'll break down the edit that I do at the final image for my blue hour shot. But again, not going to go through the whole thing because it was more of a complicated edit and would take a long time to break down for this video. So the first thing I wanted to go over was talking and maybe illustrating a little bit more of that window that you have when you're shooting blue hour of there's only like a 10-minute window of when you can get the correct exposure for your foreground and the stars. So let's go to the library mode really quick, and I'm going to show you. If you look over here, this image was taken at 7:12 a.m., and then we're going to compare it to this image that was taken at 7:19 a.m. The only differences between these two images is this image was taken at f8, and this image was taken at f4. Obviously, the exposure is just slightly different, but that is how much light is gaining in that 7-minute period. But what you're going to notice is, if you look at the histogram, like I said, the exposures are very similar, but check out the sky. See how many more stars are in this earlier image, the 7-minute prior image, compared to this image, and there's far less stars in the sky. And that's exactly what I'm talking about earlier in the video, is timing that exposure so that your foreground light, let's say on the rock in front of me and on the mountains in the background, and the amount of stars that are in the sky that is basically that window that I'm talking about. Like, this is what's really important about Blue Hour if you're trying to get everything in one shot. Now, technically what I could have done is taken this particular shot, which has more stars in it, waited just 10 minutes to where the foreground is just lit just enough. But like I said, you're going to run into that problem where balancing between the mountain here and the background of the blue sky / dark sky, depending on when you take it, is going to be more difficult. So I just really wanted to articulate that and show it in a photo form so you understand what I'm talking about, that it really matters when you take those photos. The best thing you can do is just show up early and take shots as the sun comes up. So the actual photo that I ended up with is this one. I'm not entirely finished with the edit, I don't think. There's a few things that I still want to change, but this particular photo was using 3 shots. This shot, and this shot. And it's just a pano, and I'm actually going to put on the screen right now as I talk about it a time lapse of me putting this pano together, combining it, and doing some luminosity masking and painting some more light back in, and trying to fix a lot of the stuff on this particular pano because it's a 16mm wide pano. So I did perspective blend, I did the perspective projection of the pano, meaning the top image is very skewed, but thankfully it made everything in the rock actually look proportionally correct. So what I did is scrunch down the stars and fix that stuff and did some warping, and I did some perspective warping and quite a few things, and it would have taken too long to just show everything. And the final images I ended up with are this one and this one, and then I used these 2 images as layers in Photoshop, open them up, and luminosity mask them. So let's go through the edit once I had everything balanced really quick. So we'll go to the Develop tab. So the first thing I'm going to say is that I warmed up the image just a little bit, and you're going to notice that I brightened the exposure quite a bit. I actually like the image exactly like this, where it looks dark and there's just a touch of light here and there, and it's really, really moody. I actually like this image exactly like this more than anything else. The problem is if I publish this image like this, where it's this dark, it's just going to look dark on most people's screen. This looks great on my screen, but if I try to print this or if I try to publish it online, it's just going to be too dark. So I know that I need to brighten it up a little bit. And this is just one of those things that I've checked on my phone, I've checked on other screens, and I just know that it's too dark. And again, this is one of those things also that I'm not entirely sold on yet. I still need to make sure that this is the correct brightness that I want. I brought down the highlights a little bit, brought up the shadows and the whites. Whites are going to be really important when you're doing Blue Hour shots because it's really going to brighten up those stars and that little bit of light that's on your foreground and background. Brought down the clarity, brought up the texture. You might be wondering why I brought down the clarity. I just kind of like that softness feel recently, but I like the texture on the rocks, so I kind of balance those 2 out. A tiny bit of dehaze to fix a little bit of the haze in the sky. Brought down the saturation. That's to combat a little bit of the contrast that's added into the image. As you add more contrast, things get more saturated. I added a little bit of sharpening, but I didn't boost the sharpening too much because the original images that I was using were already sharpened. Add a little bit of noise reduction because these images are at 3200 ISO. Removed chromatic aberration, just a standard thing that I do. And then I brought up the calibration on the blue and brought down the hue just a little to make it more red. And finally, I added a few masks that we'll go through really quick. As you can tell, I used a sky mask, and then I intersected it with a linear gradient so that I could basically, the final result is just to darken right on the horizon so that blend between the mountains and the sky is a little bit better. This one I actually ended up darkening the sky with the mask just to add that effect of nighttime rather than it being so bright. And then these 2 masks I'm not entirely sold on. When I click these on and off, pay attention to the stars in the image. It adds a little bit of a glow to a few of the stars in the image. Not entirely sure I'm sold on this yet. I'm on the fence, but for now I'll leave them on. And then finally I added a graduated neutral density here to darken that right-hand part of the frame because it was just a little bit too bright originally. And that is where I'm at with the edit. So I hope this was helpful in terms of understanding a few of the tips and things that you need to do for Blue Hour. Again, let's reiterate those. The first one is scout your location because otherwise you're going to miss the window, which is the second tip, and it's knowing the window. You need to shoot basically in that 10-minute window. It'll depend on where you are in the world because sometimes sunrises and sunsets last longer in my experience. But here in America or decently close to the equator, sunrises and sunsets happen pretty quickly. So you're only going to have about a 10-minute window when the exposure on the foreground and your background to capture the stars is correct. And the last thing is just making sure you know where the sun rises and sets based on your composition. Anyways, I hope that was helpful. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, you can consider liking the video. And if you loved it and this was super helpful, consider subscribing because we're going to have more of this stuff on the way. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next week. Later.
The sun is gonna rise each and